Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Revenant Ecologies, Defying the Violence of Extinction and Conservation, by Audra Mitchell. Narrated by Holly Adams. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. One of the lessons I've received while writing this book is the importance of introducing oneself, that is, of locating oneself within lines of history, identity, relationships, community, and place. This is a practice that most of my Indigenous interlocutors carry out as a matter of course, yet it is generally ignored and or frowned upon in Western scholarship. I've been taught that these introductions need to be offered not only to humans I meet, but also to the land and water, to plants newly grown, withered, or returned, to animals born, migrating, and dying, to changes in the wind, rain, and weather patterns, in the seasons and years. As these beings, lands, and life forms constantly change and renew themselves, I cannot take for granted that they know me, or I them. Introductions make it possible to locate each other, to find shared connections, and to be honest about the nature of relationships so that we can keep each other safe, especially when dynamics of violence are at stake. Where I live, in the settler colonial state currently called Canada, it is important not only to recognize on whose lands one lives, but also to acknowledge one's implication in ongoing histories of colonialism and broader social structures, to which my ancestors and I are no exceptions. So I want to take a moment to introduce myself here. I am a white, settler, disabled person born in the mid-1980s in what is currently called Calgary, Canada. My mother's family were migrants from near Lviv, Ukraine, and the eastern parts of Poland, who arrived in Treaty 1 territory in the early 20th century. My father's ancestors, from Scotland and the Isle of Man, benefited from a colonial land grant program, acquiring lands in the Miramichi Valley, Migamaki, in the mid-19th century. Their descendants, working in agriculture and the rail industry, lived on the lands of Cree, Saulteaux, Métis, and Nakota Sioux people in Treaty 7 territory, the lands of the Ni-Itsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina in Treaty 6 territory, and the Anishinaabeg, Cree, and Métis in Treaty 1 territory. I spent my first days on Ni-Itsitapi land and was raised on Hlemak and Huitlitonk lands. I have lived as part of dominant settler cultures in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Turrbal, and Yugara country, the ancestral and treaty lands of the Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, neutral, Anishinaabeg, and Huron-Wendat peoples. As a result of my ancestors' efforts to bequeath this future to me and other settlers, I continue to live on stolen lands and to benefit from colonization. As such, it is my responsibility to create good relations with the land and its peoples, to act in solidarity with them, and to respect their laws, including, but not limited to, treaties. Indeed, this book was written on the Haldimand Tract, which are the ancestral and treaty lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. The Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which are the ancestral and treaty lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and a meeting place for many Indigenous peoples, and Tiohtià:ke Munyang on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka and Anishinaabe lands. I want to offer my gratitude to the peoples who have co-created and cared for these places over millennia, and whose land it will always be. Introduction. 2 stories or theories about extinction. A wave of erasures is moving across Earth, shattering worlds in its wake. It cuts through what Western science calls species and life, but also through fragile membranes of kinship and thick histories that draw together lands, waters, airs, and energy in the collaborative work of thriving. Driven by relentless rhythms of consumption, occupation, extraction, and violence, this rupture unfolds unevenly, forcing open the seams of some worlds as it reinforces the borders of others. How can this phenomenon be grasped, explained, and responded to? According to the dominant story or theory promoted by Western scientists and policymakers, these changes mark the start of Earth's sixth mass extinction event, pointing to a rapid decrease in species and their populations over the past few decades. These thinkers predict that more than 3/4 of existing life forms may be destroyed within as little as 3 centuries. Yet, despite its devastating effects and future implications, most Western scientists view the sixth mass extinction as the unintended consequence of desirable activities intended to improve human life, or achieve what they regard as progress. As a result, they call for strategies for managing destruction and preserving life forms for the use and benefit of humans, making it possible to sustain existing global, political, economic, social, and ecological orders. This approach, conservation, has inspired a global movement, harnessing the attention, resources, and influence of states, international organizations, NGOs, and millions of citizens, especially in the global north. Since the late 1980s, conservation has focused on the need to protect biodiversity, or the variety of life forms and the functions they play within ecosystems, as a stock of resources for human use, benefit, and enjoyment. Reflecting the imperatives of international politics, conservation is often presented as an ultimatum or a zero-sum game. If it is not immediately and unreservedly adopted, expanded, and intensified, many scientists warn, we may be left to inhabit a planet stripped of its most precious treasure, life. Humans are not immune to this threat. Indeed, emerging discourses on human extinction intensify fear and urgency, framing conservation as the only possible response, and as a now or never bid to protect the survival of humanity. In so doing, these discourses mask the profound forms of violence on which conservation is based, including colonialism, racism and white supremacy, extractive capitalism, anthropocentrism, heteronormativity, and ableism. Indeed, one of the main aims of this book is to reveal that extinction and conservation are manifestations of these global structures of interlocking, mutually magnifying violence. To uncritically pursue increasingly ambitious conservation plans, including late conservationist E.O. Wilson's plan to convert half the Earth's surface to national parks, or President Joe Biden's goal of preserving 30% of U.S. land, fresh water, and ocean by 2030, is to entrench, rather than to transform, these structures of violence. However, extinction, conservation, and biodiversity are not the only frameworks that can describe, explain, and respond to the violent destruction of Earth's plural worlds and life forms. Many distinct knowledge systems, in particular those tended by Indigenous, BIPOC, and majority world thinkers, offer stories and theories of extinction that better describe the role of violence, law-breaking, and the failure or refusal to maintain good relations, often originating from sources outside an affected world. Many of these stories and theories point to forms of violence that target and break down the relationships between particular communities and their other-than-human kin, including the structures of violence mentioned previously. As such, they often call for radically different modes of response. Instead of seeking to sustain harmful structures, they demand the total transformation of dominant political, economic, and ecological orders. What's more, they provide alternative understandings of what is destroyed by what Western science calls extinction. Not just the resources or capital implied by terms like species, ecosystems, or biodiversity, but irreplaceable relationships and the conditions of co-constitution that enable the thriving of plural life forms. Foregrounding this latter set of stories and theories, this book aims to shift popular understandings of extinction, reframing it as an expression of global structures of violence. Instead of agreeing that conservation is the only possible response to extinction, it argues that multiple struggles against global structures of violence, including anti-colonization, anti-racism, land reclamation, BIPOC resurgences, the revitalization of BIPOC legal systems and modes of governance, are vital and necessary in protecting Earth's multiple possible futures. It also resists white apocalyptic future narratives that leverage the threat of a sixth mass extinction to entrench existing power structures and close down imaginaries of alternative futures. Without diminishing the gravity and enormity of the harms in question, the book pays close attention to narratives that counter the all-or-nothing logics of mainstream conservation thinking and mainstream futurisms. Indeed, it ends by examining the idea of revenants, that is, the theory that this time of immense rupture and destruction is also shaped by currents of return, of tending and renewing life toward alternative futures. In so doing, it aims to support and foreground projects of global political transformation that work toward dissolving global structures of violence and seeding multiple futures of rich coexistence. Two stories or theories of extinction. To better understand this argument, it is useful to begin with two very different stories about extinction, each emerging from specific worlds, places, and cultural contexts, and speaking to broader global or cosmological contexts. These two stories or theories offer different accounts of what extinction is, who and what is responsible for causing and responding to it, and by what means it should be addressed. By comparing these stories or theories, we can begin to challenge the dominance of discourses of the sixth mass extinction and conservation, and to see that there is more than one way of understanding and responding to the destruction of life forms. Story or Theory 1. The Sixth Mass Extinction. In the geological here and now, a wave of biological extinctions is taking place. Currently, it is accelerating. The rainforests are inexorably being cut to ribbons. In less than a century, most will be gone. Millions of species, lemurs, parrots, beetles, frogs, spiders, orchids, jaguars, are set to vanish. At current rates, another century or two should see us competing with the great extinction events of the past. We humans are briefly in the golden age of our power, our dominance. But we are destined to extinction also. Once a geological age or two has passed, there will be nothing but the odd bone or gold ring to show that we were ever here. An Armageddon is approaching at the beginning of the third millennium, but it is not the cosmic war and fiery collapse of mankind foretold in sacred Judeo-Christian scripture. It is the wreckage of the planet by an exuberantly plentiful and ingenious humanity, that is, in a final struggle with the rest of life. The race is now on between the techno-scientific forces that are destroying the living environment and those that can be harnessed to save it. These quotes embody the major themes of stories or theories of the sixth mass extinction and the global conservation movement: the rapid destruction of earthly life, the urgency of a comprehensive response, and the ultimate threat to human survival. These themes entwine as parts of a vast, epic, multi-voiced story or theory centered on a common protagonist, humanity, who confronts a profound existential crisis. Brilliant but wayward, with an immense appetite for growth, exploration, and improvement, this subject is now forced to face the unintended consequences of its efforts to better itself and follow its natural urge toward development and progress. As a result of its frenzied striving for progress, humanity has begun to undermine the basis of its own survival. As a result, it must now take on a hero's task, stopping the hemorrhaging of life forms. To complete this task, humanity must defeat the fearsome four horsemen of extinction: habitat degradation, destruction and overexploitation, co-extinctions, the direct killing of plants and animals, and the transmission of invasive species across the planet. The stakes are almost indescribably high. What happens here on Earth in this century could conceivably make the difference between a near eternity filled with ever more complex and subtle forms of life and one filled with nothing but base matter. Locked into this cosmic battle, humanity must marshal its most powerful weapons, science, technology, and knowledge, to conserve what is left of life, manage its processes, increase its diversity, restore its systemic functioning, and perhaps even bring extinct beings back to life. In this story or theory, humanity's success will determine whether it is able to continue its growth, flourishing and evolving, or whether it, like 99% of the life forms that have existed on Earth, will lapse into extinction. Fundamentally apocalyptic in its tone and content, this story or theory invokes Manichaean struggles between cosmic forces of good and evil, darkness and light, emptiness and plenitude. Despite its grounding in the apparently secular Western sciences, it explicitly invokes images of reckoning, hell, cosmic punishment, and piety in the form of conservation that speak to the worldviews of the Euro-descendant peoples to whom it is primarily directed and whose origin stories it centers. Indeed, echoing uncomfortably with millenarian discourses, this story describes the current historical juncture as cosmological crossroads embodied in a biological and geological event, a mass extinction. Defined as the elimination of 75% or more of existing species in a relatively short geological time span, such phenomena have occurred 5 times previously in Earth's history. Anthony Barnosky and his team contend that current extinction rates may, in fact, be higher than those that sparked the previous 5 mass extinction events, perhaps severe enough to carry extinction magnitudes to the Big 5 benchmark in as little as 3 centuries. Similarly, Gerardo Ceballos and his team find that the extinctions that have taken place between 1500 and 1900 would have taken several millennia to occur at the background or baseline rate of extinction. According to these authors, these estimates reveal an exceptionally rapid loss of biodiversity over the last few centuries, indicating that a 6th mass extinction is already underway. Indeed, a 2016 report by the Worldwide Fund for Nature suggests that ecological changes in the past 4 decades have resulted in a 58% decrease in populations of the animal species it analyzes. Yet despite overwhelming evidence of major changes to Earth's ecosystems, future extinction scenarios are notoriously difficult to model accurately because of the absence, and indeed the impossibility, of directly observable evidence. Since the fossil record for life forms that have gone extinct since the last mass extinction event is patchy, analysts must extrapolate and infer from past extinction events data on current extirpations or representative samples, as in the WWF report. This can produce distorted predictions, including the under- or overestimation of extinction rates, patterns, and trends. Nonetheless, discourses on extinction are shaped by an overarching narrative of declension that taps into fears of the apocalypse that are widespread within Euro-descendant cultures. Central to this narrative is a tragic irony and fable. In its efforts for improvement and a better life, amid its greed and mastery of ignorance, humanity has caused the harms that could threaten life on Earth. Unlike the cyanobacterial blooms and asteroid collisions that put an end to millions of earlier life forms, the current crisis is described as something we are doing to ourselves. As science writer Elizabeth Colbert puts it, We humans are the asteroid. Crucially, the term human is used here in a universal sense, as if responsibility for the crisis could be equally attributed to all members of Homo sapiens across vast differences of time, space, and culture. By presenting current patterns of extinction as generically anthropogenic, or the results of human activity, this story or theory obscures the vast inequalities of responsibility and suffering, along with immense differences in political and economic organization that attend global patterns of extinction and other forms of ecological violence. The same figure, humanity, is also cast as the potential victim of ecological collapse and the predicted crises to follow, including massive disruptions to economic and food systems, mass deaths, authoritarian governance, and global warfare. Some commentators recognize how unevenly harm is distributed across human groups. For instance, the Convention on Biological Diversity argues that the poor, who tend to be most immediately dependent on ecosystems, would suffer first and most severely. However, the dominant narrative presents these possibilities as threats to the survival of humanity as a whole. Indeed, the prospect of human extinction lurks menacingly behind narratives of the sixth mass extinction, as illustrated by Jan Zawasiewicz' story quoted in the first epigraph of this section. Zawasiewicz's book is just one example of a growing genre of speculative nonfiction, often written by science journalists, that imagines the demise of Homo sapiens in a biological and figural or symbolic sense. Some queer, feminist, and anti-colonial theorists see this juncture as an opportunity for transcending entrenched inequalities rooted in race, gender, sexuality, disability, and species. However, most discussion of human extinction takes place in the context of existential risk, a discipline concerned largely with prolonging the survival, enhancement, and ongoing post-human evolution of humanity at all costs, often in ways that perpetuate inequalities and harms. As this book argues, such discourses frequently justify widespread and pervasive forms of violence and oppression as part of their zero-sum narrative, which pits considerations of multi-life-form justice against the posited existential threat of human extinction. Not least among these efforts is the practice of conservation, which is presented in Western scientific stories or theories of extinction as the primary, if not the only, possible mode of response. Mainstreamed in the late 20th century, the idea has become commonplace in much of the global north and is generally presented as an unequivocally good practice. Indeed, as this book illustrates, critiques of conservation emerging from Western scientific discourses tend to focus on whether particular projects meet their intended goals or targets, not on critically questioning the practice or its logics. However, decades of resistance by Indigenous, BIPOC, anti-colonial, and other groups affected by conservation projects originating in the global north shed a different light on conservation's roots, legacy, and future goals, including its entwinement with colonialism, capitalism, land grabbing, and the destruction of indigenous sovereignties. Conservation in its dominant forms should be understood as an outgrowth of global colonialism. Indeed, as William Adams's work shows, the practice emerged from the efforts of colonial governors to protect stocks of wildlife for elite hunters in the face of heightening pressure on ecosystems from settlement, land clearing, and extermination by lower-class settlers. The displacement of indigenous communities and resulting disruptions to ecosystems, and overhunting by elites themselves. Maintaining distinctions of class and race was also a major motivation of the formation of wildlife reserves, and eventually the global national parks movement in the late 1970s starting with the creation of Yellowstone National Park in California in 1872. Promoting access for white, middle-class people to untouched nature and recreation, the creation of national parks has frequently involved the violent displacement of the people who co-created and cared for these lands for millennia. In addition, it has helped create and sustain differences of race, class, and disability by creating spaces designed to reflect and foster white, wealthy, ruggedly masculine, and non-disabled forms of citizenship among visitors. Through the 20th century, buoyed by increased public engagement with national and/or wildlife parks, international and global organizations such as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and the WWF gained significant international support and membership. Nonetheless, despite several failed attempts in the early 20th century to create an overarching international governing body for conservation, it was not until the early 1990s that an international framework gained significant state recognition. Emerging during the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity fused increasingly influential discourses on biodiversity with state-centric notions of sovereignty and resource management. It begins by stating unequivocally that states have sovereign rights over their own biological resources and are responsible for conserving their biological diversity and for using their biological resources in a sustainable manner. This wording reflects not only the extension of state sovereignty into the ecological sphere, but also Cold War-era anxieties over the integrity and strength of the nation-state in the aftermath of decolonization movements and Soviet expansionism. Importantly, in so doing, it entrenches claims to state-based sovereignty that also work to preclude other assertions of sovereignty, including those made by Indigenous peoples. Working within this discourse of ownership, the CBD also devotes substantial attention to regulating the ex situ use and management of biodiversity, including genetic materials that may prove valuable in industries such as pharmaceuticals and foods. As part of its effort to regulate such practices, including bioprospecting or biopiracy, in which private actors mine ecosystems for valuable genetic materials, and in line with its statist commitments, the CBD prioritizes in situ approaches to conservation, such as the creation of reserves and parks. However, as Chapter 1 discusses, ex situ conservation, such as species survival plans, genetic libraries, and even plans to de-extinct life forms, have all become central to conservation practices and involve significant international cooperation. More recently, notably in the 2010 Nagoya Protocol, the UN has acknowledged that bioprospecting and biopiracy also violate indigenous rights by appropriating not only resources, but also the intergenerational knowledge regarding them. However, this protocol continues to frame biodiversity in terms of Eurocentric and state-centric notions of property and intellectual property, which clashes with many indigenous political and legal systems. At the same time, since the late 1980s, international conservation efforts became entwined with two other powerful emerging doctrines: economic development and human rights. As the commercial and scientific value of biodiversity was rapidly extracted and exported to serve global markets, indigenous, peasant, and rural communities were increasingly prevented from accessing ecosystems and economic benefits. As a result, many indigenous and rural communities ignored and/or deliberately broke externally imposed conservation restrictions. For instance, constraints on hunting, gathering, or burning in national parks, or killing animals that harmed their crops, in order to survive in rapidly shifting economic contexts.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?